And now, in accordance with Standing Order 38, a motion to adjourn the House is deemed to have been made and seconded at this time. Therefore, the question is that this House do now adjourn. The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise again with respect to the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. I appreciate the opportunity to follow up on a question that I asked recently about leaked reports from the European Union that suggested that negotiations between Canada and the EU were unfolding in a way that could lead to an imbalanced deal that is not in Canadians' interests. This first document stated that the EU list of offensive interests is larger than the Canadian one, and that Canadian services are on the table while Europe's stay exempted. More recently, we have seen leaked documents, again from the European Union, stating that the EU is aggressively coming after Canadian banking regulations that helped Canada weather the blow of the global recession that began in 2008. Mr. Speaker, I have brought up similar issues with the Parliamentary Secretary before, and he generally says that he won't comment on leaked documents. Now, this might be a justified policy, except for the fact that leaked documents are all that Canadians have to go on, because this government is the most secretive of any government involved in trade negotiations, maybe in the history of our country. Mr. Speaker, I have been the official opposition trade critic for almost a year now. In that time, the Minister of International Trade has never come before our committee to update us on the progress of the negotiations once. The government does not provide us with specific information about what we are seeking to gain from the deal, and it will not provide any information about what we are willing to give up. Once again today, there was a motion before our Trade Committee to call the Minister to update us on CETA. Once again, the Conservatives made us discuss this in secret. Once again, the motion to call the Minister before our committee was not adopted. This is not how you provide transparency to Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Before being elected to this place, I negotiated hundreds of agreements, and I know that negotiations can be done in a more transparent manner. Of course, actual negotiations occur behind closed doors, but you can give periodic updates and outline what issues are on the table to the principals upon whose behalf you are bargaining, and that's Canadians. Trade negotiations are no different, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we need look no further than our partner. The European Commission, those doing the negotiations on the EU side, must give periodic, detailed updates to their Trade Committee. Our largest trading partner, the United States, also has a much more transparent process that involves their Congress in a real, meaningful way. Instead, in Canada, we get vague descriptions about a wonderful future where the Conservatives spin fanciful stories of mythical gains. Mr. Speaker, economists will tell you that these predictions are laughable, and these claims have been cobbled together by a questionable methodology that is not based on real-world assumptions. On the other side, Mr. Speaker, Canadians are expressing serious concerns about what the Conservatives are willing to give up in order to secure a deal with the EU. There are worries about investor-state dispute resolution processes that will hamstring local economic development initiatives. There are major concerns about the effect of this deal on farmers in the dairy, egg and poultry industries. Will it raise the cost of medications for Canadians and provinces? Mr. Speaker, what is needed here is transparency in the process so that we are dealing with facts rather than with leaked documents, fear, ideology and spin. Mr. Speaker, why won't the government give a briefing to this Parliament and Canadians about what is at stake with CETA so that we can see this deal before it is concluded?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think you've pretty well heard most of what the honourable member has to contribute. He summed it up himself just now: fear, ideology, and spin. That pretty well sums up what he really had to say. You know, he wants to look in a serious way at leaked documents. What's a leaked document? Who even knows, Mr. Speaker? You know, he's saying this deal should be over based on a calendar. Like, is that you going to do this on a calendar, or are you going to do this on the quality of the agreement? You know, the minister has briefed committee. He has been to committee. We've had our trade officials to committee. We've had Steve Verheul, who is our chief trade negotiator, to committee. And it's absolute nonsense that somehow the European Parliament is better briefed than our own parliamentarians. And it's a false statement, clearly. We've been to the European Parliament. And we listened to this nonsense before we went, and when we got there, we found out that the European parliamentarians on the Trade Committee and the Parliament of Europe aren't nearly as well briefed as we were on the facts of the agreement. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, that this agreement is being negotiated. You don't negotiate in public, and you don't negotiate in the press, unless you're the NDP or trade unionists, and you're using that to leverage some type of gain. In this case, I'd call that some type of supposed political gain, Mr. Speaker. You know, for his own province, for the first time, we're looking to get Canadian fish and seafood into the European Union duty-free. Mr. Speaker, that's a huge boost for British Columbia, with a great potential for the wild fish industry in British Columbia. You know, last year, or the last 3 years, I think, British Columbia shipped somewhere in the neighborhood of $324 million worth of lumber into the European Union. You know, if we can lower those tariffs, if we can move that lumber into the European Union duty-free, that's a tremendous boost for the province of British Columbia. You know, I would emphasize, just in closing, Mr. Speaker, that, you know, this is not going to be negotiated on the calendar, and it's certainly not going to be negotiated by the opposition. And when this deal is final, it will be debated in this place where it should be debated, and it will be before the committee, and we will study it in depth as our responsibilities require us to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, this is classic. The government won't talk about the negotiations, but they will spin things that fish will be a benefit to Canada. So they want to talk about the positives, but not what Canada will be giving up. Mr. Speaker, we can reach a deal with Europe that will be mutually beneficial. The EU is exactly the type of progressive high standards partner that we should be trading with. But Canadians are not convinced that the Conservative government will negotiate a balanced agreement. Once the deal is inked, there will be no changing it. It will be presented to us, and we will either have to support it or not. Here are some specific questions that Canadians want answered now, before the deal is reached. Will farmers and supply-managed sectors be protected? Will taxpayers be protected from lawsuits? Will our federal, provincial and local governments be prevented from setting policies in the interests of Canadians? Will the cost of drugs rise? And if so, does the government have a plan to help Canadians who are faced with these increased costs? Can the government answer these simple questions before Canadians are faced with a fait accompli and presented with an agreement that they have no choice but to say yes or no to? Why can't Canadians be involved in this process? After all, this agreement is for them.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, that's just patent fear-mongering. Those questions have already been answered. The honourable member knows that. You know, he's protected in this place because he can say anything he wants. It must be, this is like Christmas every day for the NDP because they're not held responsible. You're in the House of Commons. You don't have to stick to the written law or rule. You can just simply spin anything you want. Absolute, patent nonsense, Mr. Speaker. What this is about is a job-creating, pro-trade plan for the benefit of all Canadians, a minimum of a 20% increase in trade between the European Union and Canada. Jobs, growth, and opportunity for all Canadians are in this trade agreement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Abitibi